President Marion and fellow Rotarians, it's my great pleasure to introduce Cameron Madgwick to you, although he has spoken here before and so he is probably known to a lot of you. Cam grew up in Taranaki before heading off to Wellington to complete his law degree at Vic. Early on in his legal career, his interest in a young woman led him to volunteer at the Wellington and Hutt Valley Community Law Centre. Cam says that once inside the tent, so to speak, he found a greater connection with the law centre than he did with the young woman. And that connection lasted for a very long time. He volunteered more than 20 years and only stood down last December as the chair, and he is credited with playing a leading role in solving the community law o Aotearoa funding crisis. Some of you might recall that. Cam's professional career has been in the energy sector, using both his legal and his governance skills. So, since September of 2004, he's been Chief Executive of PEPANZ, the Petroleum Exploration and Production Association of New Zealand, using his passion for his home province and his understanding of how a strong and robust oil and gas industry can truly benefit a community, both financial and social wellbeing. Cam thought this the ideal job, or so he told me when we first met, when we were seated together on an Air New Zealand flight a couple of years ago. All that changed in April of this year when the government woke up one morning and announced an end to new gas and oil exploration permits. So Cam's here today to give us his thoughts on what that means for the future economic and social wellbeing of the country. Please welcome Cam Madgwick.
Thank you, Karen, for the very kind introduction. That's working. Ina mana, ina reo, e rau rangatira mā, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. So to all of those of mana, we all know what mana means, to all of those who speak te reo, and to all the rangatira, to all the leaders. So I'm pretty certain that people in this room fit into at least one of those buckets. So thank you very much for having me. I have been here before talking about access to justice, and you'll be relieved to know that I won't be speaking on that today. I will, however, talk to you briefly about the government's decision in April that Karen mentioned, and in particular why it matters, the unintended consequences of that decision, what we're doing about that to highlight some of those decisions, and what, in my view, is a much better way forward. So without further ado, why does it matter? Well, if you live in the North Island of New Zealand, chances are, whether you use it or not, natural gas runs past your house. Those of you who have an infinity hot water system on the side of your house, you're directly using natural gas from Taranaki. If you live in the South Island, I think there's about 150,000 people who use LPG, once again a derivative of natural gas from Taranaki. So everybody, well not everybody, a lot of households have access to natural gas as one of their forms of energy. It's about 22% of New Zealand's total energy, and by that I mean food production, various industrial processes that use gas as their form of energy. You can only get a certain process heat using gas or coal for that matter. You can't get it through electrification in most applications. And let's not forget electricity, of course, because gas accounts for about 15% of New Zealand's electricity. Those of you who are watching closely at the moment, electricity prices will note that the gas constraint, unrelated to the government's decision, but the current gas constraint has, combined with the low hydro lakes, has pushed our electricity prices very, very high. I would argue that's sort of foreshadowing what might happen into the future. There's some other stats up there to show you as well. Critically, there are only 7 years of proved known reserves of gas left. That's why we keep looking. It's why we explore, to keep that reserves level there. It's difficult to see the way in which the government made the decision and gave effect to its decision as anything close to a normal policy process. Sure, some of the people in this room know a bit about policy processes. I'm told that when you design good policy, you come up with a problem definition. What's the problem you're trying to solve? You work out some intervention logic to demonstrate will the policy that you're proposing lead you closer towards achieving that goal. You do some options analysis, work out what possible options there might be, do a cost-benefit analysis. You make an assessment of who's going to bear the costs and who the beneficiaries of your policy might be. And you give some consideration to any unintended consequences of your policy, i.e. you give it a really good thought before you do it. Because the alternative, of course, is that an incredibly poor process can do nothing but produce an incredibly poor outcome. And in my view, that's what we've seen here. As noted on the screen before you, there was no warning to the industry. It wasn't in the coalition agreement or the confidence and supply agreement. It wasn't in Labour Party policy. It wasn't in New Zealand First Party policy. In fairness, it was in the Green Party's policy. No cost-benefit analysis was undertaken before the decision was made. Advice that was sought from officials was essentially ignored. And then it was rushed through Parliament just to make a really good process that much better. The normal select committee process, for those of you who've been involved in one, usually allows 4 to 6 weeks for submission makers to make that submission, and then the committee itself has 6 to 9 months to consider those. And in that time they will ask officials, oh look, we heard Cameron raise this concern, could you please go away and do a little bit more information on that, answer this question for me, you know, will it reduce emissions or not, will it harm regional New Zealand or not, I don't know, just simple little questions like that. Will it cost billions of dollars, I don't know, another simple little question. You think you'd take some time, but unfortunately that process was only allowed a total of 4 weeks, so 4 weeks in which to make a submission, present a submission and report back to Parliament. That's quite an unusual process. And indeed, of course you'd expect someone who advocates for the interests of the oil and gas sector to say that. I can freely acknowledge that. You probably wouldn't expect constitutional lawyers to say the same thing, but they did. You probably wouldn't expect the government's own legislative design and advisory committee to say the same thing, but unfortunately they did. So turning then to some of these unintended consequences. This is a government report, so the government's own report says that there'll be, at the midpoint, about $8 billion of lost Crown revenue. The range was something like $2 to $23 billion Crown revenue, and that's largely made up on the taxes and royalties that are paid by the sector to the Crown every year. If anybody's interested, we're actually doing our own economic modelling because, as you know, it's not just the Crown revenue that's important here, it's what does it mean across New Zealand's economy and probably more importantly to New Zealand households. Other regions in New Zealand also won't benefit. There's a very large prospect off the coast of Oamaru, which looks unlikely to progress in these new policy settings. Of course, we heard from the government that, of course, it's all about climate change. Well, unfortunately, this particular policy is not very good for the environment. Again, unrelated, but perhaps a portent of the future, Genesis have imported 120,000 tonnes of coal to burn at the moment because we have a gas supply constraint. Perhaps that might happen in the future too. Not only does coal have twice the emissions of gas, those ships that come here also don't necessarily run on electricity. And of course, banning a fuel doesn't necessarily stop you using it. So we'll probably import that as well. Not great. Of course, all of this information was available. Speaking of Genesis, they made a promise earlier this year that they were going to phase out coal as part of the electricity generation in New Zealand, so that's essentially transitioning Huntly out of coal, incidentally into gas. Of course, when Mark came to the Select Committee, part of his presentation was, well, I'm now quite worried about whether I can meet that commitment to you, government. So, there are very real consequences being raised here. What about New Zealanders? Well, electricity prices are bound to increase. I mentioned that gas plays an important role in our electricity system. Essentially, it provides the cover for our renewables. So when the renewables aren't operating, when the wind's not blowing, the hydro lakes aren't full, the sun's not shining, you do need some other form of energy to provide that backup. And that's the role that gas and coal predominantly provide in New Zealand. Of course, when there's constraints on that fuel, what happens? The electricity price goes up. Now, most of us, we're insulated from that because we pay our electricity provider to essentially manage that risk for us, but I can guarantee you they won't cover those costs forever. A commentator last week said that the consequence of this very recent electricity price rise is a 7.5% rise in electricity prices next year. For context, the average household, that means about a $200 a year increase. So these are very real consequences. So other than pointing out these consequences and telling you all how grave they are, what have we done? Well, for the first time ever in our history, we've been around 42 years, roughly matching the Maui gas field's life. We launched a campaign because we heard from a lot of people that they were very concerned that their voice wasn't being heard. They were concerned that they didn't even know what a select committee was, let alone how to put in a submission, appear before it, have their voice heard. So we started this campaign here called Energy Voices. And it was initially designed to help people who were most affected make a submission in the process. I've just got a short video here, it's a couple of quick highlights from that. I'm sure the technology will work seamlessly because he's holding his finger on the cord.
And most of us rely on the oil company. So when we heard this news, you're going to do what you're doing, and you gave us no other, and you didn't give us any other option, we're devastated.
The loss of skilled people and the loss potentially of thousands of jobs, the cost of billions of dollars of revenue, $9 billion at a midpoint, evidence from MB, and the fact that this bill does nothing to deal with the issues of demand and an inevitable switch to importing of more oil and gas and an uptick of oil tankers coming into Madgwick Point.
Unfortunately, in our view, there has not been a no proper engagement or good information in the development of this bill.
If gas is removed from the mix, our concern is that it's going to be much harder to remove coal from power generation.
So just touch briefly on the one person I didn't mention there, second to last speaker, Liana Potu, is the chair of Te Atiawa Iwi. So she went so far as to allege that the policy process was a breach of the treaty. These are pretty serious allegations. Anyway, select committee's finished. We've been through that. Government passed the law a couple of months ago, so it is a part of our law, but we're still hearing from a lot of people out there who are saying they don't believe they were heard, they don't believe their perspectives have been taken into account. So while our Energy Voices campaign was primarily aimed at encouraging select committee submissions, we've decided to keep it going longer to be a platform for people to have their say, in the hope that the voice of the public will prevail. Of course, the government claim that the decision is all about climate change, about reducing emissions. Worth touching briefly on that. My personal view is it's the wrong tool to reduce New Zealand's emissions, and there's some other suggestions up here as to what might be better ways to do that. But New Zealand's emissions profile, for those of you who don't follow that very closely, in very rough terms, about half of our emissions are from agriculture, methane predominantly. About 40% are from energy, and about half of that, i.e. 20%, is from transport, so the the 5.2 million vehicles in New Zealand. About 6% is from industry and 5% from waste. Yeah, the common understanding from most people is that you need a demand-side response to change behaviour. So, you know, the increasing prevalence of electric vehicles, that's a demand-side response. You change the behaviour and people will move away from the things that you believe to be causing the harm. So in transport, something that moved you away from your petrol-driven car and the emissions that generates, that would be a good demand-side response. A supply-side response, i.e. curtailing the types of fuel that might be available for, say, your car, doesn't really do much unless it's attached to a demand-side response. So we think there are better ways that you can achieve lowering emissions, and I've mentioned them there. Carbon capture and sequestration, so if you can get carbon at source, so at a power station for example, you put it back from where it came. You put it back into a reservoir, back into the ground. It is proven technology, it's happening overseas, it's not science fiction. An emissions trading scheme that actually drives the right behaviours. I can guarantee you if the price of carbon was more than its current $25 a tonne, you'd see all sorts of innovation in this space. Globally, people are switching from coal to gas. In fact, incidentally, the US is the only country in the world to have neither signed up to the Kyoto Protocol nor, of course, famously to Paris, but the one who has met what would have otherwise been their emissions reduction goals. How did they do that? They shifted from coal to gas. Another interesting fact, China, some of you have heard of the One Belt, One Road initiative, so the new Silk Road. The plans for that include building one new coal-fired power station the size of Huntly every 12 days. So that's going to have quite a few emissions, one would suspect. Planting more trees. You know, New Zealand has a lot of trees coming out at the moment. They are natural carbon sinks. I suspect we're going to need to do a lot more than that. And of course, in our sector, you know, we're not immune, not only the use of our products, but the way we produce them. There are process improvements we could make, particularly around methane leakage, and we are doing some work on that. So we think there's a better and different way to take this forward. We are asking again for the government to pause and have a rethink. Even if they don't believe the arguments that I've tried to lay out to you briefly here today, I think there is space to do some analysis independently to assess whether this is going to reduce emissions, whether it is going to have positive or negative economic impacts, and whether it's going to have an impact on energy security and price. We're going to keep telling the stories. Our Energy Voices campaign I mentioned is going to keep going, and it is on social media for those of you who are active in that space. I'm being looked at here, so there might not be time for questions, but if there are, I'm very happy to take any.
I think we've got time. Time for maybe one question.
Oh, better be a good one.
Gloria.
Fracking has been a very high profile problem. Does that relate to gas as well as oil?
Fracking is predominantly related to gas, and fracking does take place in Taranaki. The Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment did a pretty detailed report on this in 2014, I think it was, perhaps 2015, concluded that the science is fine, the science of fracking is fine, doesn't present risks to food safety, water quality or anything of that nature. What it did conclude was that there were regulations hadn't really kept up with that, so there was a need for regulation to be better in place around it.
Okay, one more, Roger, and then that.
Presumably, because the legislation has gone through the House, there's only a limited amount that you can actually take in the courts. Will this be any sort of judicial review proceedings underway, or are they stepped up by the legislation?
says the lawyer. I'm a recovering lawyer, so I don't have to worry about that sort of thing anymore. Well, clearly a decision that's taken which results in the law being changed to give it effect was perhaps prima facie illegal at the time at which it was made. So I know that there is at least one party who has court action underway at the moment, Greymouth Petroleum, and that court action has been provided for in the bill. Personally, despite what some lawyers would deeply wish, I'm not sure you'll achieve the result you want through legal action. I think actually that the issues here are probably not ones that would be decided appropriately in a court. I think this is an issue, which is why the campaign's continuing. This is an issue really where the public's voice needs to be heard. You know, if you tell New Zealanders that their power price is going to increase as a result of this policy, which it will, that's going to be many times more powerful than some learned judges opining on a law change, you know, now 6 months ago.
Karen, if I can call on.
Cam, I'd like to thank you very much for coming to talk to us today. I think we all know that climate change is heating up the world, and you've delivered a clear and articulate address today to show us how the debate on the curtailment of new exploration is heating up as well. You gave a very clear outline of the consequences of the government's decision. It was sobering and it's pause for thought, and thank you very much for inviting us to watch your social media page and see how the debate develops. Members, would you join me in thanking Cameron for his address?
I'll say one last thing, very, very quickly. We do have a publication, and I've got a handful of copies if anyone's interested. It's called The Role of Oil and Gas in a Lower Carbon World, which when I read your newsletter is how my talk was pitched. So to give truth to that, there is a publication on that if anyone's interested.